Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I built around Obosh, the Preypiercer, a Rakdos commander from Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths, though recently reprinted in Multiverse Legends. This was a rather fun concept to build around, as Obosh makes you pay close attention to the mana cost of your deck and incentivizes an aggressive playstyle. That being said, as usual, I designed this deck to cost less than $45 using prices listed by Scryfall, including the cost of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, but not including the price of shipping. And as always, the deck list is linked in the description down below. Now let's jump into this deck. So, our commander is Obosh, the Preypiercer, a 3/5 legendary Hellion horror for 3 generic and 2 Rakdos mana that has Companion, which we don't care about for this deck, but more importantly, Obosh reads: if a source you control with odd converted mana cost would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. So, we have a damage doubler on a commander, which really incentivizes us to aim for all-out aggression and damage dealing. So that's how we're going to approach our 99. So our goals are pretty straightforward with this deck. We're going to fill our deck with a whole bunch of odd converted mana cost burn and creature spells, which will let us deal a whole load of damage to our opponents and their creatures. We'll also be making use of a number of interaction spells, predominantly destroying effects, which will help us clear out our opponent's boards. But ultimately, this is an all-out aggression deck, aiming to burn its opponents and their creatures with instances and sorceries, while aiming to get Obosh out as quickly as possible to make that burn doubly effective. So let's get into our 99, starting with our mana acceleration and mana fixing. First up are some classic 2-drop mana rocks with Mind Stone, Charcoal Diamond, and Fire Diamond, with Mind Stone tapping for generic, but also giving access to some card draw, and then Charcoal Diamond and Fire Diamond tapping for black and red respectively. We additionally have Prismatic Lens, Felwar Stone, and Arcane Signet, with Prismatic Lens tapping for generic, but also being able to convert mana into any color. Felwar Stone will generally tap for any color we need, and Arcane Signet taps for mana of any color in our commander's color identity. We also have Rakdos Signet, which can convert 1 mana into a black and a red mana. Up next is Liquid Metal Torque, which taps for generic, but it also taps to turn a non-land permanent into an artifact in addition to its other types, which can be really handy as red's main interaction is destroying artifacts, so this can help us deal with, say, a troublesome enchantment by turning that enchantment into an artifact and then using something like Crush or Shatter to destroy that artifact. And finally, we have Navigation Orb, which costs 3 generic to cast and 2 generic to activate, and lets us search our library for up to 2 basic lands and or gate cards, which we reveal, put one onto the battlefield tapped, and the other into our hand, then shuffle. So this is basically a slightly better Cultivate effect, but for more mana and available to non-green decks, which gives us access to something we almost never get at budget prices: fetchable dual lands. Normally I talk lands at the end of the video, but I'm going to bring up some now as they're important for this card. We have Gone Gate, which lets other gates enter the battlefield untapped and can tap for mana colors that a gate you control can produce. And then we have Rakdos Guild Gate, Cliff Gate, and Black Dragon Gate, which all tap for black and red in this deck. So what I suggest is that you crack Navigation Orb, search for Gone Gate and one of the other 3 gates, put Gone Gate onto the battlefield, the other gate into your hand, and then on your next turn, you can play that other gate untapped, and you now have 2 untapped dual lands to work with. Great mana fixing, though a little expensive, though you can pay the cost on separate turns, and I kinda just consider it a green effect but not in green tax. Now that we have our mana fixed, let's talk about our creatures, all of which will have odd converted mana costs. First up is Blisterspit Gremlin, which for 1 mana can be tapped to deal 1 damage to each opponent, but with Obosh on the field it will deal 2 damage. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, untap Blisterspit Gremlin. We also have Guttersnipe for 3 mana, which, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Guttersnipe deals 2 damage to each opponent. Then we have Scab-Clan Berserker, also for 3 mana, which has Haste, Renown 1, which means when this creature deals combat damage to a player, if it isn't renowned, put a +1/+1 counter on it and it becomes renowned. And it also has, whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, if Scab-Clan Berserker is renowned, it deals 2 damage to that player. We also have Sin Prodder for 3 mana, which has Menace, and at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library. Any opponent may have you put that card into your graveyard, but if they do, Sin Prodder deals damage to that player equal to that card's converted mana cost. Otherwise, put that card into your hand. So basically, either somebody gets burned, potentially doubly so from Obosh, or you get an additional card on your upkeep. There's also Tunneling Geopede for 3 mana, which deals 1 damage to each opponent when a land enters the battlefield under your control. Brash Taunter for 5, which has Indestructible, and when it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent. It also has an activated ability letting it fight another target creature, so this can basically turn an opponent's big creature against them. But with Obosh on the field, you're dealing double the damage Brash Taunter received. We also have Charging Tuscadon for 5, which has Trample, and if it would deal combat damage to a player, it deals double that damage to that player instead, or with Obosh on the field, 4 times as much damage. Demon of Loathing for 7, which has Flying and Trample, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player sacrifices a creature. Siege Dragon for 7, which has Flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you destroy all walls your opponents control, and when it attacks, if a defending player has no walls, it deals 2 damage to each creature they control without flying. We also have Drakuseth Maw of Flames for 7, which has Flying, and whenever it attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target and 3 damage to up to 2 other targets. We also have Orca Siege Demon for 7, which has Trample, and whenever another creature dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Orca. And when Orca dies, it deals damage equal to its power divided as you choose among any number of targets. There's also Karvik the Merciless for 7, which states, when an opponent casts a spell, Karvik deals damage equal to that spell's mana value to any target. And finally, some very silly cards in this deck, Malignus and Heartless Hidetsugu, both for 5. Malignus's power and toughness are each equal to half the highest life total among your opponents, rounded up, and damage that Malignus would do can't be prevented. And Heartless Hidetsugu can be tapped to deal damage to each player equal to half that player's life total, rounded down. So with Obosh on the field, Malignus can one-shot any of our opponents, and Heartless Hidetsugu will either kill all our opponents, or leave them with 1 health, which will be easy to deal with by using our next part, Burn Spells. First up is our classic, Lightning Bolt, which deals 3 damage to any target. Play with Fire, which deals 2 damage to any target, and if you dealt damage to a player, you get to scry. Shock, which deals 2 damage to any target. Shower of Sparks, which deals 1 damage to target creature and 1 damage to target player. Tar Fire, which deals 2 damage to target creature or player. Brimstone Volley, which deals 3 damage to any target, but if a creature died this turn, it deals 5 damage instead. Blightning, which deals 3 damage to target player, and that player discards 2 cards. Sizzle, which deals 3 damage to each opponent. Breath of Malfagor, which deals 5 damage to each opponent. We also have Underworld Dreams, which deals 1 damage to an opponent whenever they draw a card. And finally we have Unstable Footing, which for 1 mana makes it so damage can't be prevented this turn, but if you kick it, it'll additionally deal 5 damage to target player. Now that we've talked about spells that can damage our opponents, though also frequently their creatures, let's focus on our interaction to deal with our opponent's boards. First up are some damage dealing interaction spells with Lithomantic Barrage, which can't be countered and deals 1 damage to target creature or planeswalker, but it deals 5 damage instead if that target was white or blue. Blazing Salvo, which deals 3 damage to target creature unless that creature's controller has it deal 5 damage to themselves. Electrostatic Bolt, which deals 2 damage to target creature, but it'll deal 4 damage if it's an artifact creature. And Nahiri's Warcrafting, which deals 5 damage to target creature, planeswalker, or battle, and it lets you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the excess damage dealt this way. You may exile one of those cards and put the rest onto the bottom of your library in a random order, and then you may play the exiled card this turn. We also have Crush, letting you destroy a non-creature artifact. By Force, which costs X in red, and lets you destroy X target artifacts. Rakdos Charm, which lets you choose one of the following, exiling all cards from a target player's graveyard, destroying a target artifact, or having each creature deal 1 damage to its controller. Bedevil, which lets you destroy a target artifact, creature, or planeswalker. Doomblade, which lets you destroy a target non-black creature. And finally, Feed the Swarm, which lets you destroy a target creature or enchantment an opponent controls, then you lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. Alright, and now let's move on to some buffs and other effects that'll make this deck just that much more effective. First up are some spells that give us haste, which include Swiftfoot Boots, Expedite, and Footfall Crater. Swiftfoot Boots being an equipment that gives its creature hexproof and haste. Expedite gives us haste until the end of the turn and replaces itself through card draw, and Footfall Crater enchants a land, letting it tap to give a target creature trample and haste until the end of the turn. We also have Pain Magnification, which has our opponents discard a card whenever they're dealt 3 or more damage from a single source. Note that that source doesn't have to be controlled by us. There is also Unleash Fury, which gives a target creature double the power until the end of the turn, but this will stack with Obosh, meaning if Obosh is on the field, our creature will deal 4 times the damage. And speaking on stacking with Obosh's effect, we have Dictate of the Twin Gods, Angrath's Marauders, and City on Fire. Dictate of the Twin Gods and Angrath's Marauders are damage doublers, and City on Fire is a damage tripler. So if you stack this with Obosh, you're dealing a lot of damage real fast. Now Red's not exactly well known for its card draw, but we're in Rakdos colors, so we can make this work. First up, we have Blood Pact, Sign in Blood, Read the Bones, and Foreboding Fruit, all of which will have us draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. Read the Bones will additionally have you scry 2 before you draw your cards, and Foreboding Fruit has Adamant. If at least 3 black mana was spent to cast a spell, create a food token. We also have Browbeat and Risk Factor. Browbeat states that any player may have it deal 5 damage to themselves, but if no one does, a target player, yourself, gets to draw 3 cards. Then Risk Factor has a target opponent decide if they take 4 damage or let you draw 3 cards. Also good to note, with Obosh on the field, these spells deal 10 and 8 damage respectively, so your opponents will probably let you draw. Next we have some wheel-like effects with Vindictive Flamestoker, Collective Defiance, and Magus of the Wheel. Vindictive Flamestoker has you put an oil counter on it every time you cast a non-creature spell, and then, for 6 in a red, you can sacrifice it to discard your hand and draw 4 cards, but it costs 1 less generic to activate for each oil counter on Vindictive Flamestoker. Collective Defiance can cost anywhere from 3 to 5 mana, and lets you choose 1 or more of the following effects. You can have a target player discard all the cards in their hand and then draw that many cards, a way to refresh your own hand, or you can have it deal 4 damage to a target creature, or deal 3 damage to a target opponent. And finally, Magus of the Wheel gives a true wheel effect. For 1 in a red, you can tap and sack Magus of the Wheel and have each player discard their hand and then draw 7 cards. We also have Valakut Exploration, which for 3 mana has Landfall. When a land enters the battlefield under your control, you exile the top card of your library, which you may then play for as long as it remains exiled. And, at the beginning of your end step, if there are cards exiled with Valakut Exploration, put them in their owner's graveyard, and Valakut Exploration deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of cards put in the graveyard this way. Unfortunately, this is one of those situations where reading the card doesn't actually explain the card particularly well. Regardless, our final bit of card advantage is Phyrexian Arena, which, at the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and lose 1 life. And now that we've gotten through all of our spells, let's go through our lands. We have the 4 previously talked about gates, some scry lands in Crystal Grotto, Zalfir Void, and Temple of Malice. We also have Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, and Myriad Landscape. Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse are basically reskins of each other, and they let you tap and sack them to search your library for a basic land card, which enters the battlefield tapped. And Myriad Landscape lets you tap and sack it for 2 mana, and then lets you search your library for 2 basic land cards that share the same land type, which you then put on the battlefield tapped and shuffle. We also have a slow land with Smoldering Marsh, which enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. There's also Rakdos Carnarium, a bounce land that has you return a land you control to its owner's hand when it enters the battlefield, but it gives you both black and red. We also have Foreboding Ruins, which is a reveal land which can enter the battlefield untapped if you reveal a swamp or mountain from your hand. Shadowblood Ridge, which can convert 1 mana into red and black, and 2 life gain dual lands in Occam Refuge and Bloodfell Caves. And finally, we'll round out this deck with 14 mountains and 6 swamps, as this deck is heavily red focused. Now let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is ringing in at just under $44. As always, this includes the cost of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, but does not include the cost of shipping. Now there's plenty of cards that you could use to upgrade this deck, and here's a small selection to consider. First up is Jeska's Will, a quite expensive card, but one that can lead to some very explosive turns. You can choose one, or if you control your commander, both, of adding red mana for each card in a target opponent's hand, and exiling the top 3 cards of your library, which you can play that turn. There's also Uncivil Unrest, which gives non-token creatures you control Riot, where they ETB with either haste or a +1/+1 counter. Additionally, creatures you control with a +1/+1 counter on them deal double damage to permanents and players, which will stack with Obosh's effect. We also have Tybalt's Trickery, a janky red counterspell where you're basically gambling that the card on top of an opponent's deck is less scary than the one that you're countering. There's also Path of the Pyromancer, which has you discard your hand, add red mana for each card discarded, and then you draw that many cards +1. And finally, we have Wheel of Misfortune, another wheel effect that, unfortunately, our opponents can avoid losing their hands, but it gives us a way to entirely refresh our hand. That all being said, if you'd like to adapt, build, or play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. Also, the channel recently hit 100 subscribers, which is honestly astonishing to me, as I'd never imagined that this channel would grow nearly as fast as it has been. So truly, thank you. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and if you happen to want more budget commander decks, maybe consider subscribing if you haven't already. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.